Welcome, everyone, to New York State Council of Churches seminar on wealth inequality, taxation, and economic development. This seminar is part of a series of many seminars looking at different policy areas where we take an in-depth look at the major issues of our time. We are seeking to bring together experts, lawmakers, and activists to learn about current and pending state and federal legislation, and in some cases, local legislation. And we will reflect on these policy areas through a theological lens while trying to address structural racism in all of its forms. Days and times for these seminars will vary to allow participant scheduling flexibility, and all these seminars will be held on Zoom and recorded for future reference. And each seminar that we do is going to contribute to the development of the New York State Council of Churches 2023 legislative ask. So I'm really pleased that everyone could be here today. Our next seminar coming up immediately will be on December 16th from 10 to 12, where we will discuss affordable housing. We're blessed to have Rachel Fee, who is the head of the New York State New York Housing Conference, and also Senator Brian Kavanaugh, who is the chair of the Senate Housing Committee, and Laura Harding, who is the new executive director for Erase Racism, among other guests for Right to Counsel and AIDS Housing. So please come and join us this Friday from 10 to 12. So I'm going to start just a little bit of reflection and begin with the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is blessing the little children. Then little children were being brought to him in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them, but Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not stop them, for to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." And then he laid his hands on them and went on his way. I sometimes wonder if this biblical passage about Jesus welcoming the children in the face of great opposition from his uptight disciples should be the basis for federal and state policy when it comes to treating the most vulnerable in our society, and especially our children. As we stare at a yawning gap between the rich and the poor in New York, facilitated by the Trump tax cuts of 2017, we continue to give priority to the disciples with their personal and corporate wealth, while at the same time, we are real sourpusses when it comes to expanding the child tax credit, investing in childcare, healthcare, and housing. It's a little amazing in Congress this week that in order to get some Republicans to support the credit, Democrats have to agree to giving even bigger tax breaks to corporations than they already received under the tax cut offered by Trump. It's as though the disciples in the Congress and the New York State Legislature take collective offense that the needs of children might supersede their need to hand out another corporate subsidy or tax break to those who need it least, and won't spend their windfall or invest it very wisely anyway. And it would be nice if the disciples had a little more humility in knowing that their wealth was made possible by the labor of slaves, and more recently, housing, education, and labor policies, which favored white people to the exclusion of Black people. It turns out that a more biblically and economically sound approach is for us to invest in people from the bottom up and the middle out instead of from the top down.
Hello.
All those businesses which seek to thrive would be better off, frankly, if their customers had better wages and income, and at the same time did not pay such high percentages of their income on housing, childcare, and healthcare, which ties up even more of their money, which could be used to build wealth and care for their families. Let us rededicate ourselves in this time to social justice, which according to the John Lewis Center is, quote, the communal effort dedicated to creating and sustaining a fair and equal society in which each person and groups are valued and affirmed.
Hello.
It encompasses.
Sheila, you need to mute yourself.
Yeah.
So sorry.
It encompasses efforts to end systemic violence and racism in all systems, devaluing any person's dignity and humanity. It recognizes that the legacy of past injustices remains all around us. Therefore, it promotes efforts to empower individual and communal action in support of restorative justice and the full implementation of human and civil rights. Social justice imperatives always push us to create a civic space defined by universal education and reason and dedicated to increasing democratic participation. The New York State Council of Churches, we were founded in the late 19th century around these social justice principles, seeking to collect together to address collective sin, which in some ways affects the vulnerable and the poor and the disenfranchised, and to seek to alleviate that sin by addressing the problems of poverty and strengthening the social safety net while advocating for strong unions. It's in that spirit that we enter into this seminar and our time together as we look at the question of wealth inequality, taxation, and economic development. So at this time, I'd like to invite Nathan Gusdorf, who's the executive director of the Fiscal Policy Institute, to offer some reflections out of their work, and particularly on the topic of wealth inequality and racial wealth inequality.
Thank you so much, Peter, and it's a pleasure to be here. I had prepared some slides actually based on a report we did. Is it possible for me to share my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so I may have to enable.
Yep, I'll do that for you right now.
All right, thanks. So this is going to be a little wonkish, but I'll try to keep it.
Oh, we like wonkish.
Okay, well, don't be careful. Yeah. Let's see. Go to slideshow. All right. Can everybody see this?
Yeah.
All right. So again, now I've got admitting privileges. So I'm Nathan Gustorf. I'm the executive director of the Fiscal Policy Institute, and we don't have a long time, so I'm going to try to be efficient while still giving you the highlights of a report that we recently put out on inequality in the state of New York and tax policy options. So just to start out with an overview of where we're headed, New York has the highest inequality in the state. We look at that both in terms of wealth inequality and in terms of income inequality. Now, we also want to wrap in a discussion of our tax system for a few reasons we'll talk about. One is that the current tax system is regressive, so it's basically an unfair tax system, and fairness needs to be an important priority in how we structure our tax code. But the real purpose of our tax laws isn't just to be fair, it's to raise money to pay for good things. And so when we look at all this inequality, we should also see it as a real opportunity to significantly increase the funding for our welfare state spending and our public services and our public investment, and imagine what we could do in the state. So I'll also go through some of the options that we have written about and that we're proposing in the current legislative session for how to address inequality and how to really maximize our revenue potential. First, at a high level, we probably all agree there's something wrong with inequality, but it's good to think about what exactly is wrong with inequality. So you could object to it for political reasons. We know that the wealthy are powerful and that their wealth allows them to control the political process and exploit their workers. You could be an egalitarian and think that it's just inherently wrong to have, so much wealth concentrated in the hands of so few when there are so many people who are hungry and housing insecure. You could be concerned about it for racial justice reasons. Wealth is overwhelmingly concentrated in white households, and that's particularly true of extreme wealth, which is what this is going to focus on. 92% of extreme wealth in the country is held by white households. What you might think about a little bit less is that there are good economic reasons to be opposed to this kind of inequality. The wealthy don't consume as much of their income and their wealth as normal households, but it's good for the economy when people spend money. So when you have huge disparities in income, you have to remember that the wealthy are saving and investing a lot of that income. They're not spending it. So it's not really economically productive. They also tend to make a lot of bad investment decisions. And it would be better in sort of general economic and human terms to capture some of that wealth and really invest it in public goods. And then, as I was saying before, this has big implications for our fiscal policy, which just means how the state spends money. It really changes what we can do in terms of state spending. All right, so with that said, what are some of the numbers? Well, you may or may not have heard of an organization called ITEP, which is a leading national think tank that studies state tax and economic policy. So they recently produced a report about extreme wealth broken down by state. And they define extreme wealth as households with more than $30 million in wealth. And based on that definition, they find that in New York, these extremely wealthy households collectively are worth $6.7 trillion. And I have to say that number surprised me. The billionaires alone in this state are worth $673 billion. Now, this total number, 6.7 trillion, that's the highest concentration of extreme wealth in the nation. In terms of billionaire wealth alone, it's a little bit higher in California, but California has twice the population that New York does. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of extreme wealth concentrated in this state. In terms of how many people we're actually talking about, we always say, oh, there are X many billionaires in the state. It's kind of helpful to have a sense of how many households we're talking about who are extremely rich. So the 30 millionaire households, that's about 28,000. So here it says tax filers. Normally people file as a household, like you're married filing jointly. So there are about 28,000 families, households, married couples in the state worth over $30 million. And that's based on the ITEP report. Based on IRS data, which is slightly older, there are over 56,000 households that are worth at least $5.5 million in this state. So that number is really getting into the top 1% of the wealthy in the state of New York. An important concept here that it gets picked up a little bit less, but in terms of tax policy and revenue raising is very important. is the idea of unrealized gains. So we're all familiar with it in the case of having, say, a little stock portfolio. You don't pay any tax on the appreciation in your assets until you sell them. So it could be a valuable work of art, it could be a stock or a bond, but the asset appreciation is called an unrealized gain until you sell it, and then it's a realized gain. A lot of the wealth of these ultra-rich households is held in unrealized gains because they own large parts of big companies or real estate portfolios, or they have other investment holdings, and those appreciate over time, and they don't sell them off because they're basically just holding. So in terms of the broader category of the ultra-rich or the extremely wealthy, ITAP estimates that of that 6.7 trillion, about 3.1 trillion is held in unrealized gains. And of the billionaires, they hold about 2/3 of their $670 billion in unrealized gains. So this is important, one, because they're not paying tax on it now. So as they're getting all of that asset appreciation, they're not paying tax. But a lot of it will actually escape taxation permanently because of a feature of the federal tax law that really only rich people and tax lawyers know about, called step up in basis at death. Someone has questions, we can talk about it, but without going into the specific mechanism, basically, normally your stocks appreciate, you sell them, and you pay tax on all that profit. But because of this feature of the tax law, if you have all that appreciation, you don't sell it, and then you die and pass it on to your kids, your heirs never pay tax on it. So a huge amount of accumulated wealth completely escapes taxation. So let's shift for a moment from wealth inequality to income inequality and think about the fact that, one, these are not necessarily the same group of people, but there's a lot of overlap, maybe total overlap. Two, our tax system taxes income, it doesn't tax wealth. And so on one hand, that's an issue. On the other hand, it's something we can take advantage of. And so as we go forward, we need to think about tax policy options that basically maximize our current revenue while also responding to this accumulation of extreme wealth and the fact that this wealth isn't getting taxed. So income inequality alone is shockingly high in New York. This is the Economic Policy Institute, which is a great national think tank. They estimated that as of 2018, the top 1% of incomes in New York were about 44 times the average incomes of the bottom 99%. In Manhattan alone, the top 1% earned an average of about $9 million a year, just their annual income. And the top 1% of income earners earns about 1/3 of all income earned by New Yorkers, which is around the same level of inequality seen as right before the Great Depression. And that's higher than the national trend. So this shows you basically over the course of the last century, New York's income inequality as against the country's income inequality. And you can see that in general, there was this decline in the middle of the century and then it's come back up. But in the periods where it was very unequal, there was much higher inequality in New York, just because of the concentration of financiers and bankers and the ultra-rich in New York. And so over the past 20 years in particular, it's really gone right back up to that level where it was prior to the Great Depression. Evidently a place we don't want to be. Okay, so let's switch from talking about inequality in the state to the tax system and what we might do about inequality. So this chart shows you the tax burden as a share of income. This doesn't pick up wealth. It's not something that we measure. This is just about income. And so that means that it's not accounting for a lot of the assets that rich New Yorkers own. But even when you just look at income, the bottom 40% of the state and the top 5% of the state have about the same tax burden. They pay about the same share of their income in tax. And the way you get to that number is you look at income tax along with sales tax and property tax, because most people pay all of those taxes. And when you add up the effect, even though you may hear that the rich in New York pay like too much in tax, or that it's unfair because they pay so much of the state's tax revenues, that's only because they're so rich. As a share of their income, they're about equally burdened as poor and lower middle income New Yorkers. And the sort of middle class is slightly more burdened. But really, you would like to see a much higher burden placed on the wealthy to even approximate some level of fairness. Okay, so what do we do about it? Somewhat briefly, we need to sort our tax policy options into three general categories. One is income taxes. The state's personal income tax raises most of the revenue that the state uses. It's about 2/3 of tax revenues. And so there's always a really important focus on the personal income tax because that's where we get a lot of money. The second category is we'll go through our taxing businesses. We get quite a bit less, but still some meaningful revenue from business taxes. And then the last category is wealth taxes. And we can talk about what it means and what the options are to tax wealth. So in 2021, the state imposed higher tax rates on people earning like really high incomes. The brackets are people who earn over $1 million a year, people who earn $5 million a year, and people who earn over $25 million a year. Those are temporary rates. They're scheduled to sunset in 2027. Our estimate is that they bring in about $3 to $4 billion per year. So when those expire, it's going to be a big revenue loss. But really, those top brackets, they could be increased. You could add more brackets. There's a lot of room for increased progressivity in the state's income tax. One important component of the income tax is investment income, or what we call capital gains. There's a very large federal tax benefit for investment income. For the top earners, it's about 15%. So we think it would make sense for the state to impose a small surtax just on that category of income, and that could produce around $1 billion a year. Capital gains or investment income, again, overwhelmingly goes to pretty wealthy households. That's about 80% of capital gains revenues in the state are from households that earn over $500,000 per year. Okay, so that's personal income taxes. We have a separate category of business taxes. There are a few things that we're suggesting that we think would be good changes. One, there's a slightly higher corporate tax rate this year that's set to expire. We think that the expiration of that will produce about $1 billion revenue loss. So the rate should at least be extended, but it would really make sense to raise it. Donald Trump's main legislative accomplishment was to lower the corporate tax rate by 14%. There's a federal law provision that the state could conform to or increase its conformity with called Global Intangible Low Taxed Income, known by its acronym GILTI. And this basically targets the profit shifting of multinational corporations into their overseas subsidiaries. And then lastly, we often speak about corporations and businesses as though they're synonymous, but they aren't. Most businesses today are not organized as corporations. Most of them are what we call pass-through businesses. They're LLCs and partnerships, and they get a different tax treatment. But it's important for those businesses to pay tax as well on their business income. And we have a proposal for a slight change to the existing pass-through business tax that would raise a few $1 billion as well. Lastly, since this whole thing's about wealth, what do you do about wealth? Well, we do have an estate tax. And the estate tax is a wealth tax because it taxes an individual's total wealth at death. But there are a lot of problems with the estate tax. One is the thing I talked about earlier, that step up in basis at death, where there's basically this big hole in the estate tax that leads to a lot of accumulated wealth not getting taxed. The other is that huge amounts of wealth are exempted from the tax entirely. $12 million at the state level, $25 million at the federal level. So a lot of rich families don't pay any estate tax. And the biggest problem is that there's a very large and sophisticated estate tax planning industry that has found every which way to exploit loopholes in order to minimize estate tax liability. So you could reform the estate tax. There are interesting proposals around how to do that and really try to shore that up. The other thing you could do is just go for a straight wealth tax. And people often think we don't have a wealth tax, but the property tax is a kind of wealth tax, because a wealth tax is a very simple sort of tax. It's just, say, 2% of your wealth. Well, that's how the property tax works, except the only wealth that's being taxed is your real property, which is predominant, so really we're talking about a lot of middle-class homeowners. A traditional wealth tax would just tax all of your assets. That's currently prohibited under the state constitution. So the constitution would have to be changed in order to allow that. And there's this thing called the mark-to-market income tax, which is not actually a wealth tax, but it's a little bit of a workaround. And it's really an attempt to tax all of those unrealized gains that the extremely wealthy have, sort of in light of our inability to impose a traditional wealth tax. All right, that is the end. I hope I didn't go too long.
No, it was great. Okay, well, thanks. Thanks, Nathan, for that that really precise analysis that could maybe leave us all a little bit depressed, but we're here to try to reverse these gains that are made by the wealthy, and I appreciate you laying out some of the revenue raisers that might be possible. Our next guest is going to be Kate Breslin, Executive Director of the Schuyler Institute, which really devotes itself to children and the alleviation of child poverty. And so, Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about child poverty, poverty in general, and the child tax credit in particular.
Will do. I also prepared a little bit on childcare in case you wanted that too.
Please do. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
So
yeah, thank you, Peter. And Nathan, that was great. Thanks for that. It's great to be with you all. I think last year at this time, my coworker Dee Dee Hill talked with you about some of the same topics. Schuyler Center has been around for 150 years, working to shape New York State policies that affect disenfranchised people and populations. And I'm proud to continue that work. We also are the home of Medicaid Matters New York, and we're one of the leaders of the Empire State Campaign for Childcare. So we have a special lens on childcare. So I'll talk first about some issues related to child poverty and the child tax credit, and then a bit about childcare. So by any measure, New York children are more likely to experience poverty than children in the US as a whole. In 2021, approximately 747,000 New York children, almost 20% of our kids, experienced poverty. And Black and Hispanic children experience poverty at much higher rates due to historic and structural and ongoing racism in all kinds of policy areas. Among the lessons that we learned from the pandemic, government has the capacity to quickly and sharply reduce the number of children living and experiencing poverty. The expanded federal child tax credit by itself cut child poverty by 43%. So we have the tools. Over the last couple of years, our organization worked to establish the Child Poverty Reduction Act. So the reason for that was we had found, over the years, we work on issues related to children and families in poverty. And, each year we found we would have, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back. and never sort of a comprehensive understanding of, in the myriad of policies or budget items that got passed in a given year, what was working to get our kids out of poverty. And honestly, from the Great Recession that, you know, many of us remember in 2008, child poverty didn't really budge much. There was not, you know, intentionality around trying to reduce it. So we worked hard to see the implementation of the Child Poverty Reduction Act, which commits the state to cutting child poverty in half over the next 10 years with attention to racial equity, and creates an advisory body to make recommendations to the state about how to do that, and also creates an expectation of measuring progress over time. And that law was enacted about a year ago, signed by this governor. And the governor has now seated a Child Poverty Reduction Advisory Council, and it has met once. It will meet again early in the new year. And one of the first things it will be expected to do is, when the governor releases her executive budget, will be to assess the executive budget with regard to its impact on child poverty. So the act doesn't solve the problem, but it gives us some new tools, and it creates an expectation that the state will focus on how the policies and budget decisions they're making affect child poverty. We know that, for example, income transfers to families, even modest ones, can improve outcomes for children in all areas of well-being, from health to educational achievement to future earnings. Young children, the very children who are presently excluded from New York's child tax credit, are more likely to live in poverty and more likely to suffer far-reaching negative consequences as a result of experiencing poverty. So some of the issues that we have focused on at the state level, most of our work is at the state level, with a wonderful and beautiful group of advocates who care about cutting child poverty that I invite you to join us if you'd like. We've focused on some evidence-based and evidence-informed practices that have an expectation of cutting child poverty. So the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a roadmap to reducing child poverty a couple of years ago, and identified the types of interventions that could have an impact. And they included things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, nutrition assistance, and expansions of childcare assistance and other kinds of assistance. So we've been working hard on the child tax credit in New York, and so New York State's child tax credit presently excludes children under 4. We've been working to try and get those children included into the child tax credit. We know that young children are the poorest among us. They're the most diverse in our state, and they're the poorest. And so we've been working to get them covered by the child tax credit, as well as getting the credit to start in at a lower income level, so it doesn't exclude the many families who have incomes that are too low to get the full credit. Last year, we had a small victory in the form of a relatively small and temporary expansion in the state's child tax credit. I think for us, that was really just a signal that somebody's finally paying attention. The legislature, was included in the final budget. So again, it's relatively small and temporary, but a signal that people are paying attention to both the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit in New York. And then this year, just last week, a state senator, Senator Gounardes, introduced what what he's calling the Working Families Tax Credit, that tries to fill some of the gaps in the state's earned income tax credit and the state's child tax credit by including the children who are under 4, including children regardless, or families regardless of citizenship status, and allowing those with the lowest income to receive the largest credit. And so I expect we'll be hearing more about that. Again, it was Senator Gounardes who introduced that together with Senator Cooney and Assemblymember Hevesy. And then right now, also, we've been working, there is still some hope that the current Congress, as I said earlier, the federal child tax credit expansion that was temporary and has now expired, cut child poverty dramatically. And there is an effort right now to try and convince our federal lawmakers to re-expand the federal child tax credit. I think the bottom line is that, we have the tools, we know what to do. We need our policymakers to make the choice to make some investments. So as I said earlier, I would invite you to join us in any and all of this. And then I'm going to turn now to childcare. I know that part of this conversation is about economic development as well. So, for us, childcare is a poverty, it's a child development issue, it's a poverty issue, and it's an economic development issue. So I'll start with the bad news, the challenges that are facing families, and then move to where I think there's some opportunities and the way forward. So long before the pandemic, childcare was unaffordable for almost all New York parents. High quality childcare is the largest bill for some families with children. Back in 2020, the annual cost of care for one infant in a center, a childcare center, was more than $16,000. That's for one. And then it was 10,000, more than 10,000 for a family and for a child in family-based care. The good news is that just this past August, the income eligibility for childcare subsidies increased to 300% of the federal poverty level. That's $83,000 for a family of 4. So that means that it was previously set at 200% of the federal poverty level. It's now gone up to 300%. So that's a big expansion in the number of children and families that are now eligible for subsidies. Subsidies are not an entitlement like certain other programs. They're based on available resources. So we estimate that 250,000 more children are now eligible for subsidy than they were a year ago. However, all those families must still meet other eligibility requirements like immigration status, work requirements, and go through a lot of bureaucratic hurdles. There are also really confusing eligibility levels in different counties. They're all different in different counties. So even with this high cost for families, those tuition costs fall short of meeting the actual cost of providing the care, leaving childcare providers forced to pay themselves and their staff at near poverty wages. According to the Department of Labor, the average median childcare wage is $31,800. And it shows that the childcare sector is paid less than 96% of all other job categories. And New York's early childhood educators, nearly all women, and many of them women of color, live in poverty at more than twice the rate of New York workers in general. And then these economics, the sort of high cost of care for families and the inability for childcare workers to earn a living wage have led many providers to close their doors or reduce their capacity. we know that thousands of providers since the pandemic started have closed their doors, and childcare capacity has declined by more than 10,000 slots among licensed providers between January 2020 and July 2022, and rural, upstate, and poor communities have been hit the hardest. And the problem is even worse for families that need non-traditional hours of care because the rates paid to providers are just too low to cover the costs. So this treating childcare as a private service, which is what we do, rather than the public good that it is a flawed model. It already was a flawed model, and the pandemic really just shone the light on that and sent things crushing down. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen often stated that the free market works well in many different sectors, but childcare isn't one of them. And then also one trap that we shouldn't fall into is leaving it up to employers to voluntarily provide childcare benefits, because that'll likely deepen inequality in access to childcare and deepen income inequality, including between white women and women of color, who will be less likely to have access to these sort of special benefits offered only by big employers. So the good news is that the pandemic really did bring a new awareness about how essential childcare is to the economy and to child well-being and to families. And it also pointed out how flawed the system is. So the New York received some federal funding. They received, billions of dollars in 2020 and 2021 that was earmarked for childcare. And the state still has millions of dollars that just haven't yet been spent. So we're keeping our eyes on that for the coming year. We also have a governor in office who has long been a vocal champion of childcare. She's a working mother. She's had her own childcare experiences. And we now have some legislators who are fierce champions for childcare. So as I noted earlier, we recently raised the subsidy eligibility. So more families and more kids are eligible for childcare. But those expansions won't even be able to be implemented if there are no educators available to staff programs, if there are insufficient programs in the community. That's the biggest risk we face right now. So for us, the top priorities for the coming year are a significant and sustained supplement to be paid directly to the workforce until New York transitions to a new payment model that covers the cost of a real wage for the workforce. That's not a significant and sustained supplement is not the answer, but we think it's a bridge to what we hope will be a universal public system. You know, that's our light at the end of the tunnel. And then we're also working to remove barriers to childcare assistance that keep many families who are income eligible, keep them from accessing care. That includes immigrant families, families where parents work in the gig economy or have fluctuating hours. They tend to have a hard time proving that they are eligible for assistance. So we are very excited to invite you all to join us in this work. And I appreciate the chance to be here today. Thanks.
Before we move to our next speaker, I just want to ask if people had any questions for what you've heard so far. I did have one for you, Kate. So how would you handicap the odds of the federal tax credit passing Congress before December 31st? And are there any compromises that might have to be made in order to get it passed?
I think the chance of it, it wanes. But I don't think it's impossible. The chance of it wanes every day. We just did, as you know, Peter, a big big rally on Saturday, along with in New York City, along with our colleagues in Rochester. I think people are paying attention. We hear that the White House is open to it. I don't know if Nathan or Ron is tracking it maybe any closer than I am. I don't want to shut the door on it, but yeah.
Okay. Well,
It's
sounded-
what's frustrating is the data are clear. There's just no
Yeah.
question,
Right.
And so, to some of Nathan's points earlier, our messaging has also been, no cuts, no tax breaks for corporations and wealthy people without, an expanded child tax credit.
So that sounds actually like the trade-off a little bit of tax. If you want a tax cut at the top, you have to pass tax credit. But it also looks as though Biden now might agree to having a work requirement tied to
I
the
did just
tax
see that
credit.
today. Yeah, I haven't read, that
Yeah.
buzzed by me today too.
Yeah. So that could prove problematic as well, because there was no work requirement with the tax credit under the America Rescue Plan.
No, I mean, what's so important is when these tax credits can actually really be, fully phased in at a low income level, because that's what really gets people who are the lowest income,
Refundable.
out of poverty.
Refundable, right?
That's because the tax credit works by lowering your tax liability, but if you're really poor, you don't owe any taxes. So the refundable credits where they cut you a check, and that starts to look more like a kind of basic income policy that's really aimed at eliminating deep poverty.
Right. There was a question in the chat before we go to reInvent Albany, and Mike, I wanted to ask, and that is, the story of the runaway billionaires, runaway rich people leaving New York State because of our high tax rates, supposedly. Would one of you like to reflect on that assertion, which comes up as a way to basically kill any new revenue proposals for fear of chasing folks out of the state?
Yeah, so it's kind of seemingly permanent and vexing challenge. There's the good, and there have been some good academic studies that show that people, especially rich people, really don't move because of taxes. If you want to look into that, it's an economic sociologist named Cristobal Young, who wrote a book called The Myth of Millionaire Tax Flight. He did an updated paper with an economist from the Treasury Department. And it's interesting because I don't know how familiar everyone is with what they call the SALT cap, or the limitation on the state and local tax deduction. But that was part of the federal legislation to pay for the big 2017 corporate tax cut. In effect, it really is like a big tax hike on rich people in blue states. And they estimated that had about no migration impact. So in the years immediately following that tax change, there's basically no millionaire migration in response to a much higher tax increase than anything that the legislature has recently passed. The thing that's kind of a bummer about that paper is the time period in which they do the analysis also includes the pandemic. So then there is a ton of migration in 2020, but it's obviously not responsive to taxes because there isn't even any recent tax hike. Obviously, people are moving because of the pandemic. And so at FPI, we've been actually are waiting for some updated migration data from the IRS, and they delayed its publication until March. We're all ready to go in looking at the 2021 trends, because unfortunately, the most recent analysis is still all 2020 data, and it's really been kind of convenient for the conservative and pro-business voices that attribute these pandemic migration trends to taxes. I mean, a few days ago, the New York Post ran something saying that all these people left the city in 2020 because taxes were too high, which is like a completely goofy argument. There's nothing, there's really nothing there. But it's kind of an intuitive argument. It gets repeated over and over again by, pretty prominent voices. And so we are working hard to show what the evidence actually says, but it's definitely a hard myth to defeat. That said, it is really a myth. And the intuitive explanation is just that people don't really move because of taxes. People move to be near their family or for schools or for jobs. And in a way, that's even truer if you're a high earner, because you imagine that you're like an investment professional or a lawyer or maybe a fancy doctor, someone who's actually making a few $1 million a year. You've built a career in your professional network in New York. So you can afford to live here, but this is where you want to send your kids to school. This is where you have your professional relationships. And those are not very portable. So that's the kind of on the ground, more intuitive explanation for why, the difference in tax rates really doesn't motivate behavioral changes.
And the only thing I would just add is if we do have an exodus of people leaving the state, it's probably low and moderate income people who are having to pay regressive taxes and don't have jobs and services, or the cost of housing is pushing them out. And if we really want to talk about population loss, it seems like that would be a better place to focus. So,
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with everybody. What everybody said so far. I think I would just add the fact that, I think people move in search of economic opportunity. And the wealthy in New York have clearly found their economic opportunity. So, I think any of the migration that we've seen, as Nathan pointed out, was the result of the pandemic. And a lot of that migration was still within New York State. So you had a lot of people from the city moving up to the Hudson Valley temporarily. So, they're still paying New York State taxes to a degree. So,
yeah.
We also do, it's important to note, we do get people, so like Ron said, there's a lot of people moving from the city to upstate, but we also have people who move from the city to the suburbs in Connecticut and New Jersey, but they still work in New York and they still pay New York taxes. So sometimes the migration numbers don't line up with the revenue numbers, and we tend to still have increasing revenues. And it's because a lot of those people are still New York taxpayers because they work in New York, and that's the basis for taxing them.
And we'll discuss this at our affordable housing seminar on Friday, but another reason that you have people in New Jersey and Connecticut living there but working in New York is because there's more available affordable housing than in New York, which is pretty dedicated to not building affordable housing that makes it attractive for people to live here. So anyway, okay. I would like to move on, but I wanted to just be sure I honored, I see Alice was making a point about a childcare facility closing at the YMCA, is that right? And also from Samadhi, who is just pondering why we would possibly want to impose a work requirement with regards to the child tax credit. Anybody want to bite on either of those? Or what's the reasoning?
Those sound like Kate.
Hi, Peter.
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
There's
Yeah.
long,
Go ahead, Kate. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, there's long been this sort of old deserving poor thing, you know? Who counts as the deserving poor? That's long been sort of the way I think certain types of assistance has been framed. And I'm not saying I agree with it, but that often is sort of the, you know,
it's the rationale, right?
the rationale.
Yeah, I think also, that's a way to make it less expensive and a way to kind of strangle the program.
Mhm.
Okay, Peter,
Yes.
what I was saying was, I go to the Y and many of Ys, they're out there struggling now to get child care workers in their organizations, and most of them, people think the Y is for the rich and middle income, but there are also a lot of poor people that they give like I'm sorry.
Scholarships.
Yeah, scholarships too. And these kids are looked after, and I've seen it myself, but they're about to lose a lot of people in there that would help with childcare. Also, the JCC, which is the Jewish Community Center, a lot of these places are having problems because no funding as far as childcare. And most of the poor people and underprivileged and people who are middle class use them as childcare as an alternative because they can't find it outside, and employers do not give them that option for childcare. So these are the places that are losing funding for us alternatives for people at all.
Okay. Yeah, it's tough. So Kate, you want a parting shot on that? And then we're going to move to the next section.
That it's consistent with what it's terrible, and it's consistent with what we're seeing in communities all across the state. Yeah, they can't make it work. It's a crisis. I mean, we finally got some good investment, to get more people into, allowed to use subsidies, and the system is falling apart because we don't have enough providers because they can't make ends meet.
Mhm. Okay, thank you, everyone. We're now going to move to Elizabeth Marcello, who's the Senior Research Analyst with reInvent Albany, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what's happening with economic development or not.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Peter, and the New York Council on Churches for hosting me. As Peter mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Marcello. I work at reInvent Albany. We are an organization that's been around since 2010, and we work for a more transparent and accountable New York State government by helping to pass laws to improve open data, the Freedom of Information Law. We work on anti-corruption reforms, and we work to curb the bad subsidies. Those are business subsidies. So before I talk about in detail about what we're going to get our focus on for 2023, I just want to talk briefly about 3 bills that we at reInvent Albany have been pushing for that are currently awaiting the governor's signature. So the first bill concerns the powers of the New York State Comptroller. New York State spends at least $100 billion on contracts every year. And unfortunately, oversight over many of those contracts by the state comptroller was removed in 2011 at the behest of former Governor Cuomo. Comptroller oversight of state contracts, as you can imagine, is pretty important. It basically ensures that taxpayer funds are spent properly. It protects, the use of our taxpayer money from being wasted and abused. And so the removal of these oversight powers really set the stage for the 2015 Buffalo Billion bid rigging scandal, in which multiple Cuomo donors and allies were convicted of wire fraud for having steered nearly $1 billion in contracts to companies that were contributing to the governor's campaign. So as I mentioned, there's a bill right now that passed both the Assembly and in the Senate that is awaiting the governor's signature that would restore most of these powers that Governor Cuomo stripped. The legislation sponsored by Assemblyman Zabrowski and Senator Reichlin-Melnick has a lot of support. Over 30 watchdogs, community groups, and unions signed a memo of support for the legislation. And we think that Hochul needs to sign this legislation, getting these powers back to the comptroller, powers that the comptroller's office had for, over 100 years, will prevent another big Buffalo Billion-like scandal. And I can paste these memos for these bills into the chat so you can follow along. The next bill that we are working on concerns the State Public Authorities Control Board. So this is a little wonky, so not wonky as Nathan, but bear with me. During the 2019-2020 budget cycle, again, former Governor Cuomo gave his office, he gave the governor's office the power to remove members of the Public Authorities Control Board. So what is the PACB? The PACB is a little-known board that's responsible for approving the financial feasibility of projects that are undertaken by the Empire State Development Corporation and 11 other state authorities. So he basically gave himself the power to say, okay, I don't want you to be on the PACB anymore. I'm going to remove you. But there is a bill right now that is awaiting Hochul's signature that would repeal those Cuomo changes. And so the legislation was sponsored by Senator Comrie and Assemblymember Paulin. And that bill has over 27 watchdog groups and community groups supporting the legislation. Let me paste that into the chat, the memo for you. We think that it's very important that the Public Authorities Control Board be able to act independently and in the public interest to determine project feasibility. And to make such a determination, the Public Authorities Control Board, they analyze revenues, securities projections, fee projections, and other details. But when Governor Cuomo limited the powers of the board members and empowered himself or whomever is in the executive office to unilaterally remove members of the PACB, we think that it subverted the board's very reason for existing. And the PACB may have come up over dinner time conversation recently because they had a hand in approving the Penn Station redevelopment that at least everyone here in New York City is clamoring over. The last bill that we have that we've been working on right now that is awaiting the governor's signature concerns community advisory committees. So Empire State Development is required to form so-called communities advisory committees, or as we like to call them in the office, CACs, because it's a great acronym, for economic development projects. But there is no requirement that these CACs operate under the state open meetings law. And there's also no requirement that CAC meetings, meeting agendas, materials, and other minutes be published on ESD's website or made available to the public. Instead, CACs generally meet privately. In the case of Penn Station, the CAC was instructed to treat discussions and materials provided as confidential, even though those materials are subject to Freedom of Information law. And so there's a bill right now, as I mentioned, that is awaiting the governor's signature that would require the tax that requires ESD to publicize who is on a CAC, to publicize meeting agendas, materials, and other minutes on its website. And so this bill has support from 28 community groups and watchdogs. So pretty widespread support for all three of these bills that we're running out of time for the governor to sign. The days are ticking down. So in terms of what our biggest economic development priority will be for 2023, it will be killing opportunity zones. So opportunity zones are a Trump administration program that gives investors a giant tax break for placing their capital gains in designated areas that are called opportunity zones. And these are supposed to be low income and or high poverty areas that are in need of investment. Unfortunately, which may not be surprising because it was a Trump era program, the program has mostly benefited the wealthy and gone to investments in things like super yacht marinas. We found a couple of cases where it benefited, people building luxury buildings that had, and I kid you not, dog spas. It's gone to gun manufacturers, oil companies, crypto mining companies. And, beyond all of these things that generally, as I think we can agree, we don't like guns, oil, and crypto, independent research has shown that these opportunity zones disproportionately benefit the wealthy and wealthy neighborhoods. In terms of what it would mean for New York State, the Citizens Budget Commission estimates that beginning in 2029, New York State could lose up to $289 million annually from the program. And in New York City could lose up to $140 million. And so over several decades, this could obviously add up to billions of dollars. So there is legislation that was sponsored by Gianaris and Senator Gianaris and Assemblymember Denowitz that would fully decouple New York State and New York City tax code from these federal opportunity zones. Unfortunately, that legislation, fortunately, it did pass the Senate last year, but that legislation did not pass the Assembly. So we are, that's going to be a big push for us. We have 26 watchdog groups, community groups, and unions supporting the legislation. And so that's something that we're going to be focusing on. If you'd like to get on board with that with us, definitely reach out. And just more broadly, as we think about why we need economic development reforms in New York State, New York State spends $5 billion on business subsidies every year. And that's through huge mega deals that give hundreds of millions to giant companies like Tesla and Amazon. And there are smaller deals that give businesses tax breaks for creating jobs. Now, all this sounds great when you think about, smaller businesses are going to create jobs, but most studies have shown that business subsidies are a bad use of taxpayer money. So Tim Bartik is an economist with the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research that we cite his work quite often. And he did a study that found that subsidies affect where businesses decide to locate at most 25% of the time, and at worst 2% of the time. So that means that in most cases, taxpayers are giving huge corporations billions of dollars that don't benefit the economy and could instead be going to things like childcare, public health, clean water, and other vital public services. I just realized that I was improperly pasting these things into the chat, so I'm going to correct that now, but that's all I have for you, and I'm happy to take questions, or we can save those until the end.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I think we're going to move along, and then we'll have another spot for lots of questions.
Sounds great. Thank you.
But this is very helpful in terms of moving us from a sort of top-down approach to economic development to a more bottom-up and middle-out kind of investment in things like infrastructure and which probably would do more to retain businesses than the tax breaks. Okay, Mike King, Executive Director of Economy for All. Welcome, Mike. I have you up next.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody. It's good to be here. And I appreciate the attention to the issues that we've all worked on together. And I appreciate the spiritual and supernatural push for things that are very concrete and prosaic in day-to-day life. We need all the help we can get, and we need your people, and we need your prayers. So I'm sure folks have said variations on we're the most unequal state in the country. We have the biggest division between the rich and the poor in the country. That's been the whole tenor of everything we've done over the last couple of decades together. I will give a shout out to Nathan's recent report, which I hit in the chat, about wealth concentration in New York. I expect he's talked about it earlier. I'm sorry I'm late. But, you know, the recent history of tax policy and budget policy in New York is one of extraordinary successes. During the pandemic, we took money from rich people and big corporations that were hoarding wealth, and we redistributed it by law to poor and working people who needed help. That's what we did, straight up redistribution of wealth. It was successful. We created the Excluded Workers Fund. We kept hundreds of thousands of people in their apartments. We provided direct aid to tenants. We provided fair funding for schools. All the things that happened in the 2021 budget happened because we forcibly, by law, took wealth from rich people and corporations and redistributed it to poor and working people. It's incredibly popular. The polls show that those tax increases on the rich were supported by the vast majority of New Yorkers, the majority of Republicans, the vast majority of independents. Every public poll shows that taxing the rich across the country, and specifically in New York, is incredibly popular. It was also extraordinarily successful. Every single month, we have literally billions of dollars more than was predicted. A few rich people may have left, but nowhere near enough rich people left that we lost money. We gained tons of money on the deal, right? So to the extent that this feels like a scary proposition or an unpopular proposition, the redistribution of the wealth and the taxation of the rich is actually successful and popular, and folks should feel comfortable about that. We have new things to do. We can repeat our successes of the past. There are things that we can and should do in the coming state legislative session that will build on the positive success stories we have been able to win over the last decade. First of all, raising the minimum wage, right? The fight for 15 was born in New York. It was born from community organizing groups, New York Communities for Change in particular, that were just doing door-to-door community organizing, asking people what would make a difference in their lives. They were organizing fast food workers. At the time, people like me were walking around the Capitol saying we needed an $8 minimum wage or a $9 minimum wage. And the people that they were organizing said, you know, a $15 minimum wage would make a big difference in our lives. That is something we would fight for. And so the fight for 15 was not built on policy experts or economists or lawyers. It was built on what regular people needed in their lives. And New York and California raced to pass a $15 minimum wage on the same day. We helped lead the country in the organizing. We kind of, sort of led the country in the legislation. Andrew Cuomo and the Senate Republicans and the IDC watered it down significantly. But the minimum wage has been stalled since 2018. It has not been increased substantively. And we have a new initiative this year to raise the minimum wage to $21.25 by the beginning of 2027. It's the Raise Up New York campaign. I'll put the link in the chat one more time. It's a piece of legislation that has been introduced by the labor chairs in both the Senate and the Assembly. It's backed by dozens of community organizing groups and some of the largest and most influential unions in the state. And it's something that would make a real difference in the lives of poor and working New Yorkers. 2 million people would get a $2,000 a year raise from passing this legislation. And the home care workers, the caring majority, the fair pay for home care crew that are working have salary and hourly wage structures that are tied to the minimum wage. So if we increase the minimum wage, we'll be boosting those workers as well. We're continuing to try to improve their pay, make it higher than above the minimum wage than they've been able to win so far. It's a consolidated effort to help lower wage workers boost their pay across the range of occupations. The second thing we have an opportunity to do is to go straight at concentrated wealth. And I'm happy to report Nathan and I, and Monica was there too, in Washington last week. We were at the State Innovation Exchange, which is a national network of progressive state lawmakers. And the State Innovation Exchange, the State Revenue Alliance, me and Charles at Strong for All and CPD, we've got a group of at least 10 states and probably a couple more that will be introducing wealth taxes all at the same time on January 19th. We'll be working with state level actions, press conferences, protests in all of these states, and we'll be rolling it up into national level attention on wealth taxes. I'm putting a few details in the chat. If my cut and paste works out, you may have to give me one more second. But we've got a bunch of states with lots of rich people. California, New York, Washington, Illinois, Connecticut, and some states that, you know, maybe have less or maybe have not previously done high-level wealth taxes. Hawaii's in the mix here, Vermont, Rhode Island, but we expect that there will be some national attention to these states doing wealth taxes together. We're viewing it as a multi-year effort. The tax reforms that we won in 2021 here in New York included income and corporate taxes, but not wealth taxes. And the basic tax policy that people tell us is you got to have income, corporate, and wealth taxes to have a balanced tax system. Rich people can sneak the money into one of those corners if you don't tax it. And so even the Liz Krugers of the world are suggesting that it may be a good year for wealth taxes here in New York. The final thing that I'll say about opportunities to tax the rich is the renewal of the Invest in Our New York campaign. Many of you have been involved in that campaign previously. I'm going to put 2 documents in the chat that summarize the current Invest in Our New York campaign. There's one on the 5 bills that would raise $40 billion in revenue. There's one on the spending plan for investing in public goods that would invest $45 billion in revenue, all to benefit working and poor people to make day-to-day lives more affordable. That extra $5 billion comes from what Elizabeth just mentioned, the corporate giveaways. Maybe there's more than 5 billion, but there's an easy 5 that we can do to help it make it add up. And so Invest in Our New York will be rolling out an additional corporate tax reform bill that would build on and extend the tax changes for corporations that we did in 2021, a progressive income tax reform bill, 3 taxes on wealth, 1 an heirs or inheritance tax, 1 a tax on capital gains, and 1 a billionaire income tax reform of the type that President Biden did, also known as a tax on unrealized capital gains or a mark-to-market tax. So There's details on all of those bills in the documents I put in the chat. The Invest in Our New York campaign launched last week with events around the state and a decent amount of news coverage. And we expect to be working hard to help the legislature understand that this redistribution of wealth is a basic function of government, that right now we have extraordinary amounts of concentrated, hoarded wealth. There's one building in New York City, 740 Park Avenue, where the residents are hoarding $100 billion in wealth. Just one building, $100 billion in wealth, one apartment building. So it's right to change that. It's right for people of all perspectives to change that. And I think for people of faith, it's particularly important that our works demonstrate our values, and jumping into these campaigns is one of the best ways to do that. So that's my quick talk overview. I think I'm kicking it to Ron, unless I'm kicking it to Peter to kick it to Ron. So either one of you, I'm kicking.
I'll let you kick it to Ron. So thanks, Mike. Ron Deutsch.
Thanks. Stop kicking Ron, would you, Mike? Thank you all. It's great to be here with everybody, and thanks to the New York State Council of Churches. It has been a great partner, and congratulations to Peter for making it on the city and state list of 100 most powerful faith leaders in New York, which we already knew. But I want to talk a little bit to build on a lot of what's been said already. I want to talk a little bit about what really is economic development, or what it should be, more appropriately, I guess. And I want to talk a little bit about what we can, I was asked to talk a little bit about what happened in the last budget, kind of unfinished business, and then moving towards this year's coming budget. So let me just start out by talking a little bit about economic development.
Unknown.
Okay.
So one of the things that I think is really economic development in New York State, as Kate pointed out, is childcare, right? I mean, there's no question that childcare has a phenomenal return on investment. Businesses need childcare, no question about that. You know, a report from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, it really clearly demonstrated that early childhood investments provide an amazing return on investment, $16 in benefits for each dollar spent. I would put that up against any economic development program that this state has, because the return on investment on most of these economic development programs is really poor, if not non-existent. So, you know, things like childcare are totally important to our economy, to our business community, and to everyday New Yorkers who are trying to get to work. So, you know, we need to acknowledge that. And I think there has been some acknowledgement of that last year with the investments that we've seen in childcare and some of the discussion around childcare as economic development. So I do think we're kind of penetrating, if you will, that kind of brick wall about redefining economic development in New York State. So not only is childcare economic development, but I would go as far to say that home care is also economic development. And Mike alluded to the fact that, you know, many of the folks in the home care community are looking for increased wages, as well they should. They are paid abysmally, as are childcare workers. So we need to lift these workers out of poverty. I mean, what we're seeing right now is just absolutely ridiculous. We could be creating over 200,000 jobs in the home care field. We know that New York's population is aging. It's getting older. We're going to need more home care, not less home care. And there is really a problem in finding people for these positions because they pay so extremely low wages. So again, a minimum wage increase and tying home care workers' wages to a minimum wage would go a long way in helping build that pay and building that sector. I would also suggest that SUNY and CUNY themselves are economic development, right? SUNY's economic impact alone is close to $30 billion. And studies from the Rockefeller Institute of Government showed that for every dollar spent on SUNY, the state gets about $8.17 return on investment. SUNY also creates 179,000 direct jobs, and about or 77,000 of them are full and part-time SUNY employees. Another 101,000 indirect jobs are created as well. 34% of the educated workforce in New York have a degree from SUNY, and SUNY grants over 90,000 degrees each year, more than any other institution in the state. And 78% of those graduates remain working in New York State for at least 2 years after graduation. So SUNY, totally an economic engine. CUNY as well, right? 79% of CUNY graduates work full-time in New York State after graduating. Approximately 10% of the total private sector workforce in this state are CUNY graduates. And 1/3 of those with an associate's degree and 18% of those with a bachelor's degree went to CUNY as well. So no question, again, CUNY is an economic engine and is real economic development. We could go on. I mean, housing, obviously economic development as well, whether it's the construction of that housing or the provision of affordable housing for residents in New York who are struggling, all really help the economy of New York State move forward. And that's really what economic development should be about, right? Helping the state move forward. Right now, our system is just so backwards. I always like to say that the very definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And that's exactly what we're doing with our economic development programs. We keep doling out money to corporations like an Amazon or like Tesla. We're giving billions of dollars to billionaires. It just makes absolutely no sense, right? We should be taxing the wealth rather than increasing the wealth for the very wealthiest among us. So I think all of these things taken into consideration, really need to be viewed as the new definition of economic development in New York State. I think we need to change the paradigm that we've been working under for, decades now, and see the folly in it and move past it, quite frankly. So some of the other issues that I wanted to just mention, and Kate certainly mentioned this, and Mike alluded to it, but you look at the childcare, early childhood workforce, right? 96% female, over half are people of color. Same thing with the home care workforce. 91% of direct care workers are women, and 77% are women of color. Sadly, these are, again, some of the lowest paid jobs in our society, and yet the most important jobs in our society. I cannot think of a more important job than taking care of our loved ones for us when we can't do it ourselves, whether it's our parents, grandparents, or children. These are essential jobs that, have a lasting impact on people's lives and have a meaningful impact on people's lives. And the pay in these fields should reflect that, quite frankly. So as we look forward to the future, right, we just got through a budget where we had about $220 billion in spending. We're putting significant resources into the state's rainy day reserve funds, which, one has to wonder. Obviously, there was increased spending last year as a result of a lot of the federal dollars that came to New York. But we're putting a lot of money in reserves and are projected to put a lot more in reserves in the coming years. So that remains to be seen as to whether or not that is effective for our economic condition here in New York. The revenue actions of 2021, as Mike pointed out, should be lauded. The revenue actions, quite frankly, from this past budget are ridiculous. There's the gas tax holiday that we're still, living with right now. We had the middle class tax cut acceleration, which, didn't cost the state that much money, but didn't really make much of a difference in everyday New Yorkers' lives. There was some small business COVID tax relief, and then there were, the infamous property tax relief checks that always seem to roll out during an election year. I'm not sure why, but nevertheless, that's what we see all the time. So the revenue actions this year were pretty bland, to say the least, and really not very productive in terms of generating the kind of revenue that we're going to need as we move forward. There was also, billions in COVID pandemic spending, where, we talk about 800 million to emergency rental assistance programs, 800 million for hospitals, basically still experiencing financial distress, 250 million to eliminate pandemic-related utility debt for low-income households, and 125 million for the landlord rental assistance program. So again, one could question the effectiveness of that spending. Obviously, there were some boosts in housing and in education, certainly, that were welcome. But as we move forward, right, what are we looking at this year? There's a lot of debate as to whether or not, we're heading into a recession, both nationally and potentially at the state level. So a lot, it seems like the state is looking to put, again, more in reserves for a potential downturn. Revenues have been coming in fairly strong with some exceptions, but we're not sure which way the economy is going to break as we move forward. We're looking at the State of the State address on January 10th. And this year, because it's an election year, the budget will, the executive budget proposal, I should say, will likely be, from what I'm hearing right now, the first week in February, because during an election year, the governor has a longer time to release the executive budget proposal than in regular years. So, all indications from what we've seen in the press and what we're hearing from staffers, crime certainly going to be a big issue in the budget, housing likely going to be a big issue. I think it remains to be seen what some of the other big issues are going to be. But what's important to note, with the budget coming out late, it really gives us a shorter period of time for both the analysis of the budget and for action on the budget, right? The budget is going to be completed ostensibly by March 31st. So, the time period is, we're basically looking at less than 8 weeks from start to finish once the executive budget proposal is released. So that's going to push back, obviously, the hearings that the legislature, the joint fiscal committees of the legislature holds. They usually start right after the budget is released, like a day or two. So that's probably going to get stretched out again this year as well, and not start till February. So, I think there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered as to what we're looking at into the future. But I after this webinar and in listening to, many of the very seasoned professionals that we have here who are totally committed to making change here in New York, I am once again uplifted and optimistic, despite not being an optimistic person generally. So thank you again.
Great. Well, thanks, Ron, for giving us a great closer here. And so we have a good 20 minutes for conversation and questions here. And so somebody like to pose a question, and panelists to panelists are also welcome. Well, I'll make one statement. I did hear the governor give a pretty good speech at the New York Housing Conference on really zeroing in her state budget on affordable housing. And I don't know what all the details are going to be there, and you'll hear more about what could or should be in that plan on Friday. But her basic argument was that because we're not building real affordable housing at a fast enough pace, that this is going to have a lot of damaging effect on our economy. Because while she thinks we are adding jobs, they're not people who are able to afford to live here who hold those jobs and have to go to New Jersey or Connecticut and to obtain housing where they're more aggressive. And the other thing that she said is that we do a lot to block the construction of affordable housing through our zoning laws and through, these not in my backyard kinds of movements that happen, particularly in Westchester County and on Long Island. Oh, does your cat have a question? Yeah. Is there adequate subsidy for cat care? Yes.
She thinks it was perfect.
Let me ask.
So,
Oh, go ahead. Somebody, please.
so on another aspect of the housing affordability is property taxes. And so we touched on that a little bit, talking about the difference between wealth and between the mark-to-market tax and traditional wealth taxes. But I just wonder if anybody wants to comment on that. I mean, obviously, we don't want checks that go out before elections as a way to address property tax issues as an aspect of affordability, but I'm interested in what anyone thinks on how that fits into the tax proposals.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, as someone who'd been working on circuit breaker legislation for years, I think that we definitely need to do a better job at really kind of means testing property taxes and limiting them to a percentage of an individual's income. I also think that we should not be allowing our IDAs or industrial development agencies across this state to be giving away school revenues to businesses in the form of payment in lieu of taxes or pilots. There are a lot of different things I think that we can do to address the problem of affordability of property taxes for so many New Yorkers, where that's really the tax that hurts them the most, if you will. Because it's not really lining up with their income oftentimes. And, you can see across this state that in some areas, housing affordability may be better, but the property taxes themselves almost put that affordability out of range for many, working class New Yorkers. So I think we have a lot of work to do on property taxes and in our tax structure in general, right? We have to figure out, what the appropriate balance is between property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, and really make those much more based on ability to pay than we have in the past. And nice to see you, Peggy.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm curious if Mike or Nathan have any further reflections on property tax, which is really a rather regressive tax, or it really damages our progressivity.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, on the kind of tax fairness or tax policy reform point, most working and middle class people, to the extent that they have any ability to accumulate any wealth at all, it's in their house. And so every year they face a wealth tax, right? That's what a property tax is. It's a tax on your wealth in your house, the value of your house. The billionaire class, the 100-millionaire class, their wealth is mainly in the form of publicly traded securities, stocks and bonds and other financial assets. And the appreciation and value of those assets is not taxed at all. And in many cases, extraordinarily wealthy people can pay no taxes ever on their biggest sources of wealth, and then pass it on to their heirs and heiresses tax-free. And so the wealth tax proposals on unrealized capital gains, on capital gains, on inheritances are an attempt to make rich people pay what working middle class people pay every year. The other thing I'll say is that, the property tax crisis was in large part created by Republicans who cut income taxes and corporate taxes and wealth taxes on rich people in Manhattan, maintained the cost of government, and shoved the bill onto county governments, then subsequently had to raise property taxes. Right. So George Pataki, Joe Bruno, the old school Republicans from the 90s had a vision that was provided to them by right-wing conservatives in Washington that said, you can scream about taxes every year for the next 30 years if you do this thing, and they did that thing. And so our plan is to go straight at the people who have the most wealth, take their money and redistribute it to the people who need it. It's that simple.
Okay, I have a question here from Samadhi. Samadhi, would you like to just pose your question?
Yes, I belong to a church, which is quite well known, the Riverside Church in New York City. And what's very interesting, I've been doing a lot of social justice work around, at the church. And I'm just wondering, I mean, this has been great to listen to all of you. It's been very informative. Some of the information you've given, I'm going to take back in terms of organizing the congregation for some action. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how to educate and mobilize not only people at the very bottom of our social ladder who are just so damaged by the current arrangements, but also educated middle-class people who seem to deny reality. And I thought might be, some of you are doing advocacy work. Obviously, you're not just doing research, you're also advocates for certain issues. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were on educating and mobilizing.
Okay, somebody.
One of the things we've been working on more and more is making sure that we are listening to the people who we're talking about when we're looking at the data, not just listening to, but so very specifically in our childcare work, to the point Mike Kink made earlier about, we're marching around the Capitol doing our work, and you know, there were people going out and asking minimum wage workers, what is it you need? So we're working and being very intentional about it, working with childcare providers from all parts of the state and trying to get more and bringing them into the work, and you know, finding times that work for them, you know, having our meetings at night because they're caring for kids all day. And so doing the work to really and you know, engaging them as part of the coalition, not just people who tell us things, you know, as and along with that, it's been really hard, but we're working to really do something similar with parents, with families. And it's hard because, you know, we're talking about parents who have kids in childcare, you know, so it's they who are probably working, but to and again, not to just use their data, but to really make sure that we're listening to what is it that's at the top of their list and what they need. That's just one thing. And that resonates. So, you know, with the Empire State Campaign, what that meant is when we did a virtual rally last year, we had 600 people, and it meant we had legislators who really were climbing all over themselves to come and listen, you know, and show up.
This was a virtual organizing. That's interesting. And this was for your organization and Empire State Campaign on childcare issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, to involve the people who are affected by these regressive issues. Yeah, because that's where the mobilization can take place. Yep, absolutely. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah, I think we see it a lot too with a lot of the organizing efforts for, you know, a lot of these community-based groups who are engaging people who are, you know, being completely affected by our tax structure, by lack of services in New York, and helping build power among those groups in order to affect change. So I think it's very important that we listen to those type of groups and take their lead when it comes to organizing on a lot of issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, I represent Vocal New York. My name is Neil Berry, and we do a lot of grassroots organizing. I've known Peter for a while. Yeah, that's basically grassroots organizing. It's directly impacting people. We seem to have success with that. It's a great model, lobbying the state senators and their local council people and all these public hearings. So we have some effect. But what I really wanted to talk about was, I think it was Elizabeth that talked about the oversight. I think that's so big in our community is we see all this money that floats around in a lot of different community organizations. We heard about the state money, and the Empire State Development was another product of all that. All that money came in, EDC, and it was promises. I'm talking about Staten Island in particular. And certain communities were made promises, and the money was almost like, you know, you see all this media attention to all this money being sent to the locals. But the oversight seems to never hit in some of these CBOs, community-based organizations, some of these 7 impoverished zones that have been, you know, named to be the places where the money was going to come. And I think there were several bills that were supposed to be addressing that problem, where the state money would be somehow, there'd be an oversight. Are you aware of any of that? Because that's one of the biggest problems, is that if the state distributes out some of this money, the funding never gets directed to those really impacted communities.
Yeah, I'm not aware, and Ron, feel free to chime in because, you know, we work a little bit on this stuff together. I don't, you know, there's not, in general, I would say there's not as much oversight of economic development projects as there should be. And various comptroller audits have showed that Empire State Development generally does not exercise oversight over its own projects, nor do they do good monitoring evaluation to see whether, you know, like you were saying, whether their investment of money in certain projects actually yields a positive return on investment for communities and for people, you know, to residents in these places. That is definitely a big problem and something that Reinvent Albany is working on actively right now, which is better oversight over Empire State Development projects. I'm not familiar with anything outside of this comptroller power bill that's on the governor's desk that would do that in the immediate term. Ron, are you?
No.
I'll just state that we had 5 projects that were done, state down, and there was obviously in the eyes of many of the community, it was failed products. We had a stadium, we had a wheel that was supposed to be built, we had an impound outlet, we had a youth parking lot built. We've had several housing developments that just flat out panned out. So, you know, when you say return on investment on an island like Staten Island, there's not much opportunity. And these is flat out, you know, just flat out panned out.
Yeah. And that's the problem with, you know, it's a lot of these public authorities that do economic development, they largely escape public scrutiny. I think that's that's definitely a big issue in New York State, which is the amount of money that funnels through these public authorities that do these kind of projects, and how, you know, they have no democratic accountability whatsoever. Like, most people don't know what Empire State Development is. Most people don't know what, you know, the EDC is. We don't know who's on the board. We don't know how they get there. You know, it's kind of this, it's bananas, you know, it's like, who's in charge here? So I think, you know, that's a great question, and you're right to ask it, because, you know, it does leave a lot to be desired in terms of accountability.
I'm sure you really wanted that Ferris wheel, Neil. Speaking as a Staten Islander myself, or original Staten Islander.
Yeah, it's a walk up though, that's for sure. Staten Island is a place of its own. I got to tell you that.
I like to say I'm a refugee from Staten Island, currently residing in upstate New York.
Okay. Well, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Just to pick up a little bit on Sumati's thing about organizing, I think sometimes congregations and the people that's in the pews don't really, they think of these problems as something that affects somebody else, and they aren't really invited to look critically at their own lives and what's going on with things like healthcare and childcare and so on, and encouraged to really, as a matter of discipleship, try to change policy that would improve their situation. And also, I would say in congregations that there are a lot of people who come to church every Sunday who are suffering, but maybe feel that they don't have a voice, or that people believe them or would understand them, or feel that their church is behind them, and to create spaces where they can find that voice, to say that they're struggling, and then to give them concrete ways to be able to act to change policy.
I totally agree, and I think what Ron said was so important. We must reimagine what economic development looks like. I don't think that voice has been heard, you know, especially from people who don't have income. There's not really a voice for those people, and I mean, no one's disposable, so we need to include those people in the conversation. But we must reimagine what economic development looks like. I think that's something that we can do on a grassroots level, just like we do around public safety.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I don't know this gentleman, but I think he's right on, because we think of businesses as economic development. That's the way, you know, most of us think, you know, it's business creates economic development. Everything I've heard today is about people create economic development. You invest in people and you have economic development. And that's not understood.
Right. And I think the reality is we're a consumer-driven economy, right? I mean, 2/3 of our economy is based on, consumer spending. So the more money people have to spend, especially those at the bottom, they will spend it, and that will generate economic activity that will help us all.
Can I just
Yeah.
ask one quick follow-up to Elizabeth? Elizabeth, I'm curious with Empire Development Corporation, whether they list affordable housing as one of their priorities and are willing to put money into affordable housing as an economic development tool.
I wish the answer were more complicated, but it's just no. The answer is no. Yeah.
And why is that?
There's a lot of questions I have about Empire State Development and the way that the authority is run. I mean, to give some context, when Empire State Development was first founded as the Urban Development Corporation in the 60s, it was all about affordable housing, and it was about creating, developments like Roosevelt Island, where people could find nice communities to live in. But there was a turn around the time that New York City had its fiscal crisis, in which it flipped on its head, and it became this purely what we call an entrepreneurial approach to economic development, where it was all about supporting businesses. Now, there are a few reasons behind that switch, but there's no satisfying answer, right? There's no answer that says they found out that this other stuff works better to create jobs and, grow the economy, because that's not true, right? And we talked about that, or I mentioned that, and some of us mentioned that on this call tonight, is that these other supporting businesses in this way doesn't actually help communities. Things like affordable housing do. But, it's not a priority of theirs. I think Empire, in addition to that, Empire State Development is largely a tool for the governor to funnel their own pet projects down and have it managed by a public authority. And none of those pet projects are ever going to be affordable housing.
How many people who need affordable housing are on those economic development?
I mean, that's a great question. Like, why aren't those people brought into this planning process, right? When Empire State Development is making plans and policies, who is making those plans and policies? Who's making the decisions? It's not the people who need the most jobs. It's not people who need housing. It's not people who need childcare or senior care, right? It's the rich and powerful of New York.
New York City Partnership.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Real Estate Board of New York. They make a lot of the decisions on affordability of housing and whatnot. So.
Peter, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one note in terms of the education mobilization congregations. We're talking about a lot of different technical policy ways to get the stuff we need, but the most important thing is the stuff we need. There's a lot of different ways to create affordable housing, but the pure demand side of stoking people, whether they're poor, middle class, or rich, to say we got to create more affordable housing and we need to spend public money to do it, that's really important. Sometimes we get the advice, sell the brownie, not the recipe. Like, people like eating brownies. They don't always care exact details about the recipes. So that's a piece of, what you all can do is mobilize for the good things that we need and let the politicians structure the.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was thinking, Peter, of a different approach perhaps to cover all that has been covered that's so useful. And that is begin with how, discussion, what would happen to people if they had more secure housing, childcare, things of that nature. What would be the end result of that? And then what is it that we need? And to have that happen in that context, look at tax policies in New York State. housing policies in New York State, economic development policies in New York State. Does that make sense? Sort of shifting the way we approach these issues, because we always begin with this vague definition of what is economic development, usually expressed in basically consumer terms, right? How many goods are we going to produce?
Right.
I think that really just doesn't even begin the narrative where it should be beginning, which is if what would happen if people had adequate housing, education, healthcare, childcare, income? What would happen? And
Yeah.
then how is our system really not addressing that issue, and in fact creating this huge inequality?
Well, we're going to have to close. My parting shot here is that 50% of New Yorkers spend more than 30% of their income on housing. That is 50%. That is half the population. And that is true in rural, suburban, and urban settings in all parts of the state. So, that means that if you're spending more of your income on housing, you're not putting it into the economy in other places. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks for a great conversation. And if you want to join us for our next seminar, it comes up Friday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.